talk about the phenomenon of aging, and more specifically, the aging with disabilities. Aging itself is very complex, and not much was understood about aging until fairly late in the 20th century. There are a number of reasons for this. One was that not too many people lived long enough to be considered aging, and research methods were not fully developed to study the fairly small number of people who lived to a ripe age. Today, I'd like to add to that discussion of what the complexity of our notion of aging with the idea of aging with lifelong disabilities. And that's going to make it doubly complicated because, first of all, people did not really begin living in large numbers to an older age with lifelong disabilities until a number of decades later than people without disabilities began to reach much greater ages. I want to unpack today the fairly complex knowledge of aging itself and begin to raise certain questions about how to think about that population that is aging with disabilities. I think we have to recognize fairly early on that there can be some discomfort with this topic, and there has been over many years. In some ways, it's almost like in the medieval years, particularly in the 1500s, in the late medieval and early Renaissance years, when we began to see much better map writing. And it was fairly common during that time to recognize that there was still a limit to what we understood about this earth. And so sometimes you would see on medieval maps some kind of a statement of about the area beyond which not much was known. People would just draw dragons and wild animals, and sometimes they would even write on that map that here there be dragons. There's one map from the from I think the year 1430 had written on it, here are huge men having horns 4 feet long, and there are serpents also of such magnitude that they can eat an ox whole. With their limited knowledge of distant lands and uncharted seas, there seemed to be good reason why they would depict them as having dragons. Our approach to aging individually and as a society has somewhat been like this. It's been an area that's unknown, and an area of which individually and as a society we've also been somewhat fearful. There are reasons for that? Well, yes, there probably are, but I think today we're going to ignore the reasons for not approaching aging in a more direct way. Many years ago, the very first time that I taught a university course, I thought it went pretty well, and my course evaluations looked pretty good, but then I looked at the course evaluations by the students. At that time, the formats had asked the student to name one thing that this professor could do better and one thing that this professor was especially good at. And because the evaluations looked good, I expected to see some really nice things in the area where they asked what I had done especially well. But what I found among several students was that one of my best attributes was that I was young. And they wrote that, literally. It was kind of tragic to realize that next year I could not do any better than I could this year because I could not be as young as I was. And not only that, every year for the rest of my life, I was going to get worse if being young was what it took. And I think that's just kind of emblematic of the approach that we take to understanding aging. Well, yes, here there be dragons, here there be aging. The graph that you can see on this slide right now was written, and it was part of a book that was published in the 1880s by a fairly young faculty member at the Harvard Medical School at that time. And his way of representing the lifespan of a human being showed that it peaked at about age 40. And as you can see here, after age 40, there was a fairly steep decline. And so his idea was that after our mid-40s, everything seems to get worse and worse and worse, and that there be dragons. As an aside, I think we should note that George Beard, the author of that book and perpetrator of that graph, was about age 40 at that time. So he did consider himself as at the peak of his years and at the very best of what the lifespan had to offer. And during that time, he was involved in a number of disputes with other faculty members, particularly the more senior members of the faculty in the College of Medicine at that time. But he did consider them on the decline, so he was able really to pretty much dismiss them. There is one other thing that we tend to do as a result of being unwilling to deal directly with issues on aging. And I think it was kind of epitomized by Oliver Wendell Holmes. And you may be familiar with his poem, The One-Hoss Shay, but even if you're not, I'd like to talk about it for a few minutes. The poem that he wrote, by the way, Oliver Wendell Holmes is the same one who was a justice of the Supreme Court in his later years, a very talented man, but the poem that he wrote was about a fellow who committed, that in 1755 committed to building a carriage that couldn't break down, was the word that he used. And he built it using the best of materials and the best of craftsmanship for each and every part of it. But then, remember this was in 1755, but in 1855, after that one-hoss shay had been passed down through several generations, one day something else happened. And the parson owned the carriage by then. And here's the way the poem ends. What do you think the parson found when he got up and stared around? The poor old chaise in a heap or a mound, as if it had been to the mill and ground. You see, of course, if you're not a dunce, how it went to pieces all at once. All at once. Nothing first, just as bubbles do when they burst. There are times when we'd like to think about aging in that way, if we have to think about it at all. That everything's going to be perfect, and then all of a sudden it will fall apart completely. Some of us would prefer to have it that way. I was working with some of the publication material, the promotional material that had been used by the National Senior Games several years ago. And they used film of some of the participants. And I remember very vividly a filmed interview with an 80-year-old man who was still a pole vaulter and a fairly excellent one. But his declaration at that day was that I'm never going to grow old. Now, it's hard to believe that. We know that he was not setting world records of pole vaulting, and you could see just in the photographs that his body had obviously aged. Aging is not, however, like the one-hoss shay, and I think he hoped it would be. I don't think we can deny it completely, and hope that as a species we all go to pieces all at once. The phenomenon of aging itself it's a little difficult to capture because different people mean different things when they talk about it. The picture, the diagram that you can see here is one that I use to depict what I think are the four primary conceptions of aging that people tend to have. And within that, there may be fairly different conceptions. But let's go over this for a little while. When we talk about chronological aging, we're really just talking about the number of years that have elapsed in our lives. How many years old do you have to be in order to be old? That's an interesting question. Some 20 years ago, I would have said, age 60. I was 40 then. I am age 61 now. And the age at which I would consider a person to be old has changed fairly dramatically during that time. I haven't been able to convince other people that it should change, but chronological age does seem to be the way of measuring aging in some contexts. And in absolute terms, we tend to mark certain aging milestones, milestones in our years as being related to aging. You've all seen at the gift shop the special mugs for people who are over 40, people over 50, and we know that there's some magic to the age 65, at least historically that's been magic. So we do tend to pick out those those numerical milestones that seem to define how old we are or what aging is. Other people take a more empirical look at aging and say, aging really has to do with changes in our bodies over time. Those changes can be very noticeable, especially in someone who has had a stroke or in someone whose knees don't work as well as they used to, or even whose skin has aged in a way that makes them noticeable to us as an older adult, or someone who's lost his hair. And we all tend to regard those things as related to biological aging. Many of those biological changes go on the inside and are not visible to other people, but they can result in functional changes. I don't want to go into those in detail today, and there's certainly plenty of literature about them, and you may be very familiar with much of them already, but I think we need to be aware that the individual organism, changes over time, and somehow that's bound up with our idea of what it is to age. Now, so we've looked at aging as a function of the number of years that go by. That's chronological aging. And we've talked briefly about biological aging, which would be the changes of the organism over time. There are other dimensions of aging that I think that we have to recognize. As we age, there are psychological changes as well. And these changes can be in how we think about ourselves and our relation to our lives. Frequently you see changes in behavior. You see changes in sensation, changes in cognition, how we think and how we know. But we also see some other changes that might even be called psychospiritual. We become more aware that our life will have an end. Frequently, people in their 60s and later begin to ask more directly of themselves, where will I go? What will happen to me? What does the end of life mean? And they frequently clarify their religious beliefs for themselves in a way that helps them understand what their life as a whole means. And often when we reach that age, we also think increasingly about the legacy that we will leave behind. That includes the material goods, what will become of the house that I built, what will become of the family, but also what will I have left behind on this earth that will have changed things for my spouse, my children, for other people. How is the earth changed itself because I've been here? And sometimes there's an increased urgency to make sure that I leave behind something of value. But you know, aging itself isn't all chronological, and it doesn't all have to do with our bodies, and it doesn't all have to do with the way we think about and understand ourselves. Aging is also a social function. As we age, and as we're perceived as aging, people, they really begin to look at us differently. They open doors for us. They respect us in ways that they did before. They dismiss us in ways that they did before, because after all, we're not the new generation. After all, we have old ideas. Many societies, we tend to honor people as they age. The elders of the tribe, the elders of the church, are elders not just because they've changed biologically and psychologically, but because other people recognize that role. We have social institutions like retirement, like awarding gold watches, and we build those into our understanding of what aging is. Now, as it turns out, our concept of aging usually is not any one of these things. Usually it's a combination of thoughts and concepts and rules and customs that link all of them together. Chronological aging, biological, psychological, and social. They tend to have all these interconnected realities in the way in which we deal with aging in society. Let me give you just one example. You may be aware of Social Security, and Social Security is, under certain conditions, given to people with disabilities. But there is also a very standard age at which, in the United States, people are awarded Social Security. Historically, that had been age 65. We're changing the age for Social Security now, mostly for economic reasons, for financial reasons, to ensure that the system survives. But when you think about Social Security, which was initiated in the 1930s, the age 65 was picked at that time. Why was age 65 picked? Remember, that's a chronological function. Well, there was not a lot of research about biological aging, so they weren't able to pin age 65 to some very physical changes that people went through, or even to any psychological changes that people endured. In fact, what they realized in the 1930s was that they could build, based upon their economic and financial projections, that we would be able to sustain a Social Security system if we if we made the age of benefits age 65. At least that seemed to be the case then. We know now that it didn't work out quite that way for a number of reasons. But once we set it up that way, we had the chronological age 65, and it seemed to fit pretty well with the ages at which people began noticing biological changes and psychological changes, and the system of what was then mandatory retirement, which is actually a social institution surrounding aging, that somehow that all seemed to fit together to understand the phenomenon of Social Security. And if you look at many of the other things that we do that relate these four different concepts together, whether they're retirement communities, discounts for older adults if you come into the store on Wednesday morning, all those things seem to have some way of weaving together the chronological, the psychological, the biological, and the social. So when we talk about aging, we have to realize that certain knowledge or absent knowledge, certain beliefs or assumptions about aging are behind almost everything we do or say or think about aging, and they're not all one kind of belief or assumption. But we have knit together that pretty good system in which we have a fairly well-established concept of how we age, when we age, and what aging means, and how we ought to deal with it as a society. It's been pretty well knit together in our society, and in most other societies as well. Now, let me throw into that something that is a little bit different. I want to tell a story in order to talk about this. I want to tell a story about Warren, and this is a true story. Warren was born with developmental disabilities, specifically intellectual disabilities. He had the benefit of very devoted parents who were insistent that Warren be given every opportunity to grow to the maximum of his abilities. They moved the family from school district to school district as necessary to make sure that Warren got access to the best educational opportunities that he could get. And Warren really thrived pretty well with that. Warren, if I remember correctly, was born in either the very late 30s or the very early 1940s. So in much of his growing up time, we didn't have the kinds of services and entitlements for people with disabilities that we began having in the 1960s. So, but because he had a knowledgeable and very devoted family, Warren was able to thrive well enough that as an adult, he was able to work a full-time job in a somewhat protected environment. But still, he was able to work a full-time job in a large organization. And he, as an adult, he lived in a group home. So he worked at his job during the day, and he went home at night the way other people go home at night. Warren was very proud of his work. He was very successful at it. It is very well known in the organization in which he worked. But as Warren reached his 50s, people began initially in the workplace to notice that he seemed to be forgetting things more than he used to. And eventually Warren went through a very systematic medical evaluation, and it was determined that Warren was suffering from the early symptoms of Alzheimer's, which is interesting. Pretty soon, Warren's disability related to Alzheimer's progressed to the point at which he had to leave work. Okay, so here you have a fellow who has worked throughout his life, has now reached an age at which retirement seemed important, but it wasn't just because he'd reached the chronological age. He had begun to change. His body had begun to change because in Alzheimer's, your body does change. And specifically, there are brain changes that make it initially difficult for you to maintain short-term memory, and then increasingly long-term memory, and then eventually the executive functions. Warren's physical condition changed so that he had to retire. And in fact, Warren was ready for retirement. He understood it. He also understood that he had worked hard all of his life and believed that he deserved to retire, and felt fairly proud of the fact that he put in more than 30 years in the workplace. At about the same time that this retirement took place, his guardian, a family member, got a call from the group home saying, well, we need to come together and meet with Warren and you about his plans. The family thought, oh, okay, that will be interesting. He is going through a life change now. When they arrived in the group home, they asked the family member, Warren, what is Warren going to do? And Warren's response was, I'm retired now. I don't need to do anything. And his guardian said, yes, Warren's retired now. I don't know what you're really asking. Well, what they were really asking in this case was, what is Warren going to do during the day? Our our group home is not set up to provide daycare. It's just not set up for that. Warren can't stay here during the day. He has to do something else. Now, many people, when they enter retirement, will spend the first 6 months just being around home in ways that they couldn't before they retired. They were going to enjoy that time at home, and Warren had looked forward to that as well. But he was told immediately that we do not have the social institutions to support your retirement. Well, what happened then? Well, Warren ended up in adult daycare. And while there are some very good adult daycares, Warren found himself in the company of people who were chronologically much older than he was. They also found that he was in the company of people who had needs very different from his own. Many of them had medical needs, mobility issues that went far beyond anything that he had experienced. Also, there was no funding for this. Well, eventually, it was realized that this just was not working for Warren. It could not work for him, and that the institutions were not in place to support Warren's retirement. As a result, he had to go out of state, to leave the city that he had lived in for his more than 50 years. He simply had to leave there and go to another state in which he was able to find a facility which was able to support him. And Warren eventually, his Alzheimer's progressed, and he eventually was in skilled care and died within a few years, which is fairly typical of people with Alzheimer's. Okay, why are we talking about Warren? It seems like a very sad story in that he wasn't able to look at a retirement the way people sometimes do, and that the systems and supports available to him were very different and were designed for people much older than he was. The reason I'm telling that story while you're looking at this very abstract chart is that very carefully knit system that weaves together our chronological aging and our biological aging with the entire system of supports for that and for supports for our psychological aging was designed for people who are typically very different from what Warren was at the time that he aged. We simply did not have the social institutions to support him. Warren retired at an age that was much younger than people typically retired at. Warren had needs that were more typical for people who were much older than he was, and yet Warren was in surroundings that addressed the needs and the culture and the generation that was much older than he was. We simply did not have the institutions or the understanding to allow us to support Warren as he aged. The problem was basically that Warren began to experience changes in his life that relate to aging at an age that was much younger than we're accustomed to seeing them. He had Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's reaches its peak in people who are in their late 70s, but he had it in his 50s. We do have excellent supports for people with Alzheimer's, but they didn't match up to his needs. Many people can stay at home for a long time after they have Alzheimer's. They require some changes in their home, but they are able to age in place very frequently. Warren wasn't able to do that, and the reason was that his aging was complicated by his disabilities, and we just did not have the kinds of supports to allow him to do that. I think it's very important to understand in terms of biological aging, the biological aging isn't always the same as having a disease. But the biological aging can vary significantly from individual to individual. When you look at developmental disabilities, it's a fairly direct method to determine whether a child is developmentally disabled or developmentally delayed, because the ages at which children begin to develop in certain ways are, the curve is a fairly tight one. The age at which we begin to develop language is usually within a year or so. Most children begin speaking usually within an age that has an age variation with about a year. babies begin to lift their heads up, to roll over, to crawl, to put sentences together, to grasp things, to recognize individuals. And we can recognize delays in that very readily because the standard is so tight for that. But for older adults, and let's think now about the changes that we endure as older adults as being developmental more than anything else. Erik Erikson, the psychologist, did some very important thinking and writing on this. And he made sure that we do not look at developmental psychology as being something that's completed when you finish adolescence. In fact, some of his latest work explored the idea of older adulthood as being a developmental stage, a change in which we still grow, an age in which we still grow. And we need to begin thinking about aging in relation to that. But we have to remember that aging as a life stage and the manifestations of aging they can be significantly different from individual to individual in onset and in their progression, as well as in their effects on function or independence. When people age with lifelong disabilities, we kind of have to erase. I meant to go backwards in this, if you'll, okay, I'm going backwards now. The very tight way in which we've woven together all the different aspects of aging lead us to make assumptions about the way people age for people for whom these manifestations can vary tremendously. And I think that's what makes it especially difficult for us to understand aging with lifelong disabilities. We just have not been able to understand that as well as we have other aspects of aging. Now, as part of this, I would like also to look not just at individual aging, but at population aging, because that's going to be very important to understanding what the current generations of people who are aging, whether we're aging with developmental disabilities or without developmental disabilities, it's going to be very important to understand that when we try to get very practical about having social institutions and supports for people as they age. The graph that you're looking at here shows births in the 20th century. The yellow part of the graph shows the total number of births, and the red part of the graph shows the rate at which people are born. It's per 100,000 of population. As you can see from the chart, it was not a steady progression. If we were to try to think about the number of people who inhabit the earth and the increase in those numbers, which very typically, almost universally comes up as a result of the number of births, since that's really the only way we have of becoming a human being these days. You can see a very significant dip in the number of births and the birth rates around 1940. And that's a very important thing to notice, because it has a lot to do with the way we've built our institutions and the way we understand aging and the kinds of needs that we're going to have to project for. In the very early 1900s, birth rates were very high. And the reason for that was that infant survival was not very high. We had to have a lot of children in order to expect that a few of our children would survive into adulthood. That's why the rate was so much higher than the number of births itself. The rate was very high. We didn't have as many people on the earth, but people had to reproduce at a fairly great rate in order to keep the population growing. Well, why did everything go down around 1940? Well, actually, as you can see here, it started before 1940. It started around 1930. And the reason for that is the Great Depression and the way it affected the United States. In the 30s, people did not get married and did not have children. They deferred that because they did not see how they could support it. Well, one would expect by 1940 the Depression was over, and you would think that people would marry and begin having babies at a great rate to catch up. That did not happen in the 1940s, at least through the first half of the 1940s. And the reason was that the men were all gone. The men were at war. The men were out of the country, leaving women to work in the factories, to run things at home. And simply put, nobody was together long enough even to have babies. By the end of World War II, which is what I'm pointing at right now, about 1945, that rate then, the number of births began to rise, the rate of births began to rise, and what you saw was a pent-up demand. So the people began having multiple babies. Year after year they would have babies, and the birth rate went up, and the total number of births went up, and that led to a whole lot more children in the United States than we had ever had before. We call those people the baby boomers now. And this phenomenon continued right up into the early 60s until about 1964. And those children who were born from 1946 into 1964 are part of the generation we typically call the boomers. Now, one would expect that after that, because we had children growing, that the birth rate would continue to go up, and that the number of births would go up. But what happened by the mid-60s was that stopped. So now we have fewer births, and we have a lower birth rate. Why did that happen? Well, again, it was the phenomenon of more children surviving, but it was also the phenomenon of adults having more choices about how to plan and schedule reproduction. People were able to purchase fairly reliable contraception, were to choose multiple methods of contraception. People did not that tightly link intercourse with reproduction then, so we were able to have many of the benefits of married life or of coupled life without having additional births, and we didn't need to have additional births. Now the number of children per family has gone down significantly. So, and this is what caused it. Well, what does that mean? It's an interesting phenomenon, but let's talk about what that means. What that means now is that the baby boomers are going to grow older, and that as they move through this system, this huge increase in the number of people being born is going to result in a huge increase in the number of older people that we have in our society. As a result, by 2030, we are going to have 70 million people in the United States who are over age 65. But in the year 2005, we only had about 35 million. In other words, the number of people over 65 is going to double in the United States. And that's a very significant kind of change, because what it means is a greater percentage of people in society are going to be much older. The graph that I'm showing you here is called a population pyramid. And what you can see on it is, first going up the left side, are age groupings. At the top is over 100, at the bottom is under age 5. And when you get up to about here, at this level, that's about age 65. Now, one would think that the number of people, which is shown horizontally, or the percent of people in that age group is shown horizontally, one would think that if we keep having children at the same rate that we did before, that in fact that pyramid would always be bigger at the bottom. that translates into more people who are younger in society. And that's a very important concept, because the people who are younger are the people who are employed, the people who pay income taxes, the people who provide services for everyone else in society. So one would expect in a healthy society that the base of that pyramid would be greater, and that the age in which we typically have the greatest need would be at the top. It didn't happen that way because of the baby boomers and the pent-up demand for children and the way they're beginning to move through the system, as well as the fact that they did not have as many children. So we are not going to have an increasing number of people in the workforce and paying taxes and paying into the Social Security system sufficient to support the increased number of people who are going to be at an age when they will have a more routine access and need a routine access to those systems. So the pyramid just doesn't work. And here's what it's going to look like by the year 2025. We talked about the lifespan increasing. And the complexity of that problem that I showed you with the population pyramid here, where we're not going to have an increasing number of younger people to support the needs, the increased needs of older people, is exacerbated by the fact that people are going to live longer than they used to. In 1900, people lived on average for age 47. But by 2001, on average, people are living to almost 77 years. And now that we're almost to 2010, it's gone up to 78 and 79 years in many populations. So what we're seeing is that people are going to stay longer. Now, what we haven't talked about in the last few minutes is the way people with disabilities, with lifelong disabilities, factor into this as well. Well, people with disabilities are living to longer ages now than many of them used to. In 1930, a person with Down syndrome would live on average to 9 years. By 1983, 25 years. But by 1998, which is, as I'm speaking, is 11 years ago, people with Down syndrome lived on average to 49 years. Well, that's a very dramatic change, and a much more dramatic change than we were even seeing in the population as a whole. There are some reasons for it. If you look particularly at people with Down syndrome, people with Down syndrome died young because often Down syndrome is accompanied by other birth anomalies, things like defects in the cardiac system, in the respiratory system, and so forth. But through the 1960s and 70s and so forth, we've had very significant changes that have eventually served people with Down syndrome as well as the rest of the population. We've had things like open heart surgery become almost routine, ways of repairing defects in the valve system of the heart have become very standardized. And people with Down syndrome have been able many times to take advantage of those to deal with the birth anomalies that they experienced. People with Down syndrome, because of the respiratory problems, found themselves more frequently with pneumonia and found that pneumonia was a very severe problem for them. Before the time of antibiotics, pneumonia was almost universally a death sentence, but after antibiotics, which became much more popular and were really made much more available in the late 40s and early 1950s, people with Down syndrome began to survive pneumonia and began to live much longer, so that we ended up with 1998 with persons with Down syndrome living to 49 years. Now, I think it's important to look at this another way as well. The statistic that I showed you 2 slides ago, and I'll go back to this here, was assume that on average people at birth would live to 47 years, and that in 1900, and that went up to 76.9 years. Well, that doesn't tell the whole story, though, because, well, if that told the whole story, you would expect that by age 77, you would probably be getting an overdue notice, like the library sent you, with the book that you had. But the phenomenon with older adults is very different, because that average lifespan factored into it people who died at birth or at a very young age, people who died of the very serious mistakes that we make in our late teenage years, mistakes that involve cars and liquor and guns and so forth. And they were all averaged in. But in fact, in 2003, if you were 40 years old in 2003, you'd already surpassed those milestones. In all likelihood, you would have lived to 79 years old. If you were 65 years old, the probability is that you were going to reach 83. And if you are 80 years old, the probability is that you're going to reach 88.6 years. So when we look at the life expectancy of people with Down syndrome, you really are going to have to factor out that people who died very young may live to be much older than this lifespan of 49. Let's look now at similar statistics for adults with cerebral palsy. A male with cerebral palsy in 1998, 45 years old, he will live on average to be 76. So now we're beginning to see people with lifelong disabilities living to the same age, not just aging prematurely, but living to ages that approximate much more the aging experience of people without lifelong disabilities. And you see here for females with cerebral palsy, who are 45 years, on average they're going to live pretty close to the same as males will. Okay, what does all this mean in dealing with aging? First of all, for people who are aging in general, we need to develop systems and understandings and supports that are going to deal with a number of older adults that is twice the number that our system has ever dealt with before. And they're going to be a different generation. They are going to prefer to age in place. We are going to live longer with chronic disease, and we're typically going to depend on our family caregivers. And that caregiving is going to be physically, mentally, and financially demanding. When you apply this to people who are aging with lifelong disabilities, what might happen is that they're going to experience all the same phenomena of aging, but maybe at a different chronological age. Warren, whom I described earlier, was experiencing all the effects of aging about 20 years younger than is typical for a human being. And all of the resources that were designed for dealing with that level of aging were dealing with a population that was 20 years older than Warren. There was a retirement community that wanted to very seriously, here in the Bluegrass area, they very seriously wanted to explore having Warren join their community. But I think people realized that while other people in the retirement community were listening to Lawrence Welk, Warren would probably have wanted to listen to the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, or some other group of that sort that was popular with the baby boomers, and that there was a generational difference. So I guess the important point here is that people with lifelong disabilities may experience the effects of aging at a younger age, but will still be generationally the chronological age that they are and part of the same cohort of people. And frankly, that's just a set of problems that we have not thought out in terms of how to provide for a meaningful aging experience for people with lifelong disabilities. We're barely doing that for the people who are aging without lifelong disabilities, and we have not addressed the new generation that is going to be aging and is going to be twice the number of the people we've seen before. We are going to continue to depend on family caregivers, and we're seeing increasingly family caregivers who are caring for their parents, as well as their sons and daughters who had lifelong disabilities that are now aging. And as I said before, that caregiving is physically, mentally, and financially demanding. In fact, we don't use nursing homes to the extent that people think we do. Of the people over 65, only 4% of the total population are in nursing homes. And that of people over 85, only 20% are in nursing homes. And that over the last 20 years, the rates of older adults who are in nursing homes have gone down. People are receiving more and more services in their homes in order to age in place in their homes, in their neighborhoods, and with their families rather than in an institution. You can see that the system seriously failed Warren in that respect. Warren was not able to age in place, and it wasn't because Warren was personally unable to age in place. It was because we did not have the kind of social services system that would have allowed Warren an opportunity to age in place after he had retired. Those are the issues that we're dealing with. And what I wanted to do today was to point them out to you, give you a more robust understanding of aging so that you understand when we deal with disabilities and aging, we're dealing with a fairly complex set of concepts. It's a complex set of concepts that we have woven together into a fairly tightly knit system for people who age at a later age and who age without lifelong disabilities. There are so many things that we don't know about aging with lifelong disabilities that we have been unable to weave together that system. I think there is some hope for us, though. I think we need to understand it, and we need to work with it. And there are plenty of people now who are beginning to address the issue, but understanding the issue and being able to isolate the assumptions that we've made about aging and to re-question them is very important for being able to make any progress about this. I'd like to tell another story as a way of closing. Each year, we sponsor at the University of Kentucky a 3-day conference called the Summer Series on Aging. We bring in experts from all over the country to address that conference on a large variety of different subjects. And people attend from at least 20 different states annually. And over the years, it's been a very good conference. I want to talk with you about that conference in the year 2001. This was in 2002. As you may remember, 2001 was a very important and difficult year in the United States. That's when the bombing of the World Trade Towers took place, what people now call as 9/11, and that phenomenon. And anytime you went to a public arena for the year or two after that, programs almost very frequently began with some kind of a recognition of that tragedy and the importance of it and the heroism that was shown in there and the loss of the many people who died in that tragedy. We tried to do the same thing with Summer Series, but we didn't know how to do it. Usually we just welcome people to the Summer Series and we get started. Well, we happened on the idea of bringing in a group. This is a barbershop quartet called the Golden Heirs, and they were going to open the program by singing a very patriotic medley of songs as our tribute to the people who responded to that major emergency in New York, as well as to the people who died in that emergency. So we had 400 people in the conference room, and I was meeting with the Golden Heirs outside the conference room before we started, and we were doing some last-minute things, and I explained to these gentlemen, as you can see, they were all at least in their mid-70s at that time. I think they had about 280 to 300 years of life experience in aggregate among them. And I explained to them the way we were going to do this was I was going to introduce them by name, and then they would come up to the podium where we had the microphone, and they would begin their medley, and it would all be wonderful. And one of them got me aside and said, "Well, excuse me, Mike, some of our members don't do steps anymore. We can't go up to the podium. Oh my gosh, I hadn't thought of that. So my immediate response was, don't worry, we'll get the AV technician and he will move the microphone down to the main floor and we'll switch the spotlight over there and you'll be able to sing from the main floor and we'll have all the technology right there for you. And one of the other members said to me, well, how many people are there in that room? I said, oh, about 400. It's a large group. And he said, we don't need a microphone for that. I thought, are you sure? Oh, yes, we can handle that. Well, so we said, okay, we'll go with it. I was a little bit uncertain of how this was going to play out. But I went in and I welcomed everybody to the conference. And I announced that we now had the Golden Heirs who were going to open the conference with a tribute to all the people who served or suffered during that national tragedy. And they began singing as a group. And they sang loud, and they sang well. And in a conference, there are usually some people who are slow to get into the room, who are trying to get a last cup of coffee or a last sweet roll before things get started. When they began singing, everybody who was still out in the lobby put down those coffee cups and came into the room because they could hear them. You could hear them clear as a bell. You could hear them perfectly all the way through it. Okay, why am I telling you this story? Well, there was a disability in this group that I had not recognized, and it was an age-related disability. Several people could not do steps. I just didn't recognize that. And when I recognized it, I began thinking, oh, we've got a limitation here, and we're going to have to find some way to deal with the limitation. But I didn't know who had the limitation, and they never told me who had the limitation. I still don't know who in that group couldn't climb steps. But I do know that they all sang, and they sang in harmony, and they sang very well, and none of them was going to tell me about which individual had the limitation. What else do we know about these men? Well, we know that they knew what they could still do as a group. They could still sing as a group, and they could still sing very well, and they knew that even in a large group, they didn't need a microphone to do that. The little treasure that we had that day was a group of people who knew what their limitations related to aging were, who knew in what ways they were not limited, and who knew what kind of mutual support and assistance they needed to provide so that as a group, the Golden Heirs could still provide a wonderful performance that not only enriched them and uses their full potential, but which also provided a very enriching opportunity for a group of 400 people who thought they knew a lot about aging. What I'd like to suggest in conclusion is that we need to approach aging and aging with disabilities in the same way. We need to understand what the limitations are and what they aren't. We need to understand what the potential still is, even if we didn't notice it initially. And we need to address it as a group so that we will all be enriched by it. We need to do it individually, we need to do it in our communities, and we need to do it in federal policy as well. What will that entail? I think that's still to be worked out. But this is why I think we need to look at it in this way.